Hello, everybody. My name is Volker Boege. I am a senior research fellow with the Toda Peace Institute, and my work stream is climate change, conflict, and peace, with a regional focus on the Pacific. And it's a great honor and privilege for me to have been asked to give this Toda Peace lecture this year. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about my work in the context of the Toda Peace Institute. So what I'm going to do in the next 45 minutes or so is to first talk a little bit about why it's important for peace research and peace practice to engage with the current climate crisis. And then in the second part of my presentation, I want to talk a little bit more in detail about the Toda Peace Institute's work in the Pacific on the issue of climate peace and conflict. And then at the end, I'd like to talk a bit more about a workshop that we only recently had in Canberra in Australia on this topic, to give you an idea about the way we address these issues. And at the very end, I'll draw some conclusions for peace research and the peace movement. So let me start with stating the obvious, namely that today humankind is confronted with two existential threats to its survival. Number one is nuclear war, and number two is the climate crisis. And the first of these existential threats, nuclear weapons and nuclear war, has been a core topic of peace research from the very beginning. The second, the climate crisis, only rather recently has drawn the attention of peace and conflict studies scholars. And there are obvious differences between these two threats. Firstly, the threat of nuclear weapons and nuclear war is global in its character. A nuclear war would be a world war, or if it were regionally confined, it nevertheless would have devastating effects at the global scale, threatening the survival of humankind in its entirety. Secondly, nuclear war would be a rapid onset event. It would change the world from one day to the next. Its catastrophic consequences would be felt immediately. Thirdly, the sources of causation are highly centralized and can be easily isolated and identified, namely the nuclear weapon states and their strategies and policies. By contrast, the climate emergency, although also global in character, has very different effects in different locations, and it is a slow onset event with gradually increasing devastating effects. And it has multiple diffuse and decentralized sources. Finally, nuclear war is a threat for the future. Climate change is happening today. And from these different characteristics of the two threats, nuclear war and climate crisis, flow different consequences for how to politically address them. For the nuclear threat, the only option is prevention. Nuclear war has to be prevented no matter what. If prevention fails, the game is over. Politics of prevention have to be situated at the global or international level due to the global character of the threat. And politics of prevention can focus on clearly demarcated and confined sources, the nuclear weapon states and the political and military elites. And this is what has been done almost since the beginning of the nuclear age, trying to prevent nuclear war through politics of arms control, nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, nuclear weapon-free zones, strategic stabilization, confidence building, and so forth. And this was and is an undertaking at the international level. And the Toda Peace Institute stands in this tradition. Soka Gakkai President Josei Toda had called for the abolition of nuclear weapons at the very beginning of the nuclear age. And the late Daisaku Ikeda, founder of Soka Gakkai International and the Toda Peace Institute, only a few months before his passing, pointed to the danger of the threat of use or actual use of nuclear weapons in the context of the war in Ukraine, and reiterated the importance of no first use of nuclear weapons, stating that, and here I'm quoting Daisaku Ikeda, there has never been a greater need to declare and establish policies of no first use than today, end of quote. So let us now compare this to climate change. We know that climate change is an existential threat without parallel in human history. Without doubt, climate change is also a global phenomenon, and like nuclear war, it is increasingly perceived as a global security threat. But it has markedly different effects in different locations. So whereas its effects are felt over the world and can be observed in any corner of the world, these effects are far from uniform. Some parts of the world experience more frequent and more intense droughts, others higher precipitation and floods. Low-lying islands and coastal regions are directly affected by sea level rise, whereas mountainous regions far from any coast do not have these effects, but they are threatened by melting glaciers. So while every corner of the world is affected by climate change, the effects differ. And secondly, climate change is a slow onset event. It occurs gradually. Its effects are not felt immediately from one day to the next, although more and more often the gradual process of climate change is interspersed with rapid onset events, disasters like bushfires, cyclones, floods. And finally, there are multiple diffuse sources of causation. Although one can and should point to some main culprits, for instance, the multinational fossil fuel companies, and one can and should also identify countries and societies which contribute to a much larger extent to climate change than others. Climate change is caused globally in today's globalized world, with ubiquitous sources of causation from coal mines through cattle ranches to cars. And these characteristics of climate change lead to different political consequences. First of all, while there is only one option with regard to the threat of nuclear war, namely prevention, optimally through the abolition of all nuclear weapons, when it comes to climate change, there's not only one option, not only prevention, which in this case means mitigation, but also various forms of adaptation. Given that climate change is a slow onset event, there is time for and there are means for adaptation. And there's need for adaptation here and now. While nuclear war is only, in quotation marks, a threat for the future, climate change is a reality. It is happening right before our eyes and with increasing ferocity. The climate emergency is on here and now. Hence, while it is of crucial importance to continue and intensify mitigation, which is prevention, adaptation is also more and more important, because many people and societies are suffering from the effects of climate change already today. For them, mitigation comes too late. The effects of climate change cannot be prevented anymore, but have to be dealt with. Finally, mitigation and adaptation have to be pursued at all levels of world society, across all scales. They are not just processes at the international level of negotiations, as is the case with the nuclear threat. Of course, the international level of international negotiations is important, like the COP conferences, to a certain extent. But what action is required and action is possible at various scales, from the international to the local and the individual. Climate change can be addressed and has to be addressed by actors and institutions across scales, at the micro, meso, and macro levels. So while anti-nuclear peace movements and the epistemic community focused on the prevention of nuclear war, had no other option but to try to influence or put pressure on the nuclear powers, the climate change movement of today has a much broader range of options for action, and at the same time a much more comprehensive and diversified challenge to deal with. So, as you know, peace research and peace movement have a long history of dealing with the threat of nuclear war. And without doubt, it is of utmost significance to maintain and even intensify research and activities in this field. The almost total collapse of the nuclear weapons control regime and the dangers of new weapons technologies make it more important than ever to confront the threat of nuclear war with new energy and new ideas, as the late Daisaku Ikeda has reminded us many times. The threat of climate change, by comparison, is a relatively new field for peace research, but there are multiple reasons for peace research to engage in this field. Climate change has to be an issue for peace research because of its economic, political, social, cultural, and other effects, because these effects are conflict-prone, they pose risks to peace and security, albeit in markedly different ways than nuclear weapons and strategies. But one has also to take into account that these effects of climate change can directly enhance the dangers of nuclear weapons. For example, in the summer of 2018, bushfires in California in the USA threatened nuclear and missile facilities of the US military. And floods, storm surges, and landslides can also threaten nuclear facilities. Climate change can negatively affect peace, or put it the other way around, can cause or enhance violent conflict, and violent conflict can negatively affect climate change policies, or put the other way around, peace is a prerequisite for effective climate change policies. So climate change policies and peace building have to be linked. And because of the multiscalar, diffused, but ubiquitous nature of conflict-prone climate change effects, peace research has to address the nexus of climate change, conflict, peace, and security at different scales in a variety of contexts. And in fact, over time in the last years, research and findings regarding this nexus of climate, conflict, and peace have become ever more complex and sophisticated. Trying to disentangle, and here I quote from a journal article from 2007, one of the first articles dealing with these issues, trying to disentangle the long and uncertain causal chains from climate change to social consequences like conflict. End of quote. Researchers are in agreement today that there is no direct causal link, that there's no direct causal link between climate change and violent conflict. So it would be misleading to talk about climate wars, and sweeping statements about climate conflict relationships are neither helpful nor warranted. On the other hand, the environmental, economic, social, cultural, and other effects of climate change can contribute to societal configurations and processes which can lead to violent conflict. In other words, context and pathways matter. So instead of talking about climate change as a cause of violent conflict, today the preferred way of talking about this issue is to talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, or more recently, a risk multiplier. And the focus of research has shifted to what is called the climate fragility nexus. Fragile states and situations are seen as being particularly conducive to the emergence of violent conflicts linked to the effects of climate change. In other words, climate change induced conflict is more likely to escalate violently in contexts that are already conflict prone or have recently experienced violent conflict, and or when there's a lack of institutional and adaptive capacity and of legitimacy and effectiveness of institutions of governance, in particular state institutions, but also civil society or customary or traditional institutions. So this means that the importance of institutions and quality of governance have to be foregrounded. Governance, climate change governance, as well as governance more generally, is crucial. With governance networks in the particularly severely climate-affected and fragile countries and regions in the global south, not only encompassing state institutions, but also a variety of non-state actors from spheres of traditional governance, for example, chiefs and elders, who are very important in the Pacific, and civil society, for example, churches and other religious entities or community-based organizations. So let me now zoom in to the Pacific region in order to illustrate the challenges of the climate conflict peace nexus in a specific region. And so I'm going to explore how to address this nexus from a peace research perspective in a Pacific societal and cultural context. At the Toda Peace Institute, we chose the Pacific as our regional focus because the region is a climate change crisis hotspot. The effects of climate change, such as sea level rise, coastal erosion, saltwater intrusion, ocean warming that leads to coral bleaching and reef degradation, increase of extreme weather events like tropical cyclones, droughts, and floods, challenge the lives and livelihoods of the people of the small island states of the region. They threaten land security, food and water security, habitat security, livelihood security. Natural resources become degraded and scarce. Settlement and infrastructure are under threat. Particularly severely affected are low-lying atoll islands, coastal locations, river deltas, and inland river communities. And against the backdrop of the climate emergency, the future of entire societies and countries becomes uncertain. Some islands could become uninhabitable or even totally inundated in the not too distant future. Consequently, the Regional Organization for the Pacific Islands Forum, in its Regional Security Declaration of 2018, the so-called Boege Declaration, stated that, I quote, "Climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihoods, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific." End of quote. And so over the last years, the Toda Peace Institute organized debates among academics, policymakers, and practitioners from Pacific Island countries and some external experts about how to approach the problem from a Pacific perspective. An early result of these discussions was the Toda Pacific Declaration on Climate Change, Conflict, and Peace from 2018, which ever since has formed the basis of our work. And this declaration is not only interesting with regard to the issues that were identified as conflict prone or already contributing to violent conflict in the Pacific region, for example, resource scarcity, food insecurity, and in particular climate change-induced migration, but also with regard to how conflict-sensitive and peace-supporting climate change policies should look like. It builds a case for the inclusion, and here I quote from the declaration, the inclusion of dimensions of the climate change conflict nexus which have been widely ignored or underestimated, such as cultural and spiritual aspects, gender, traditional customary law and knowledge, together with contemporary indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of climate change adaptation, of conflict transformation, and peace building. And it stresses the importance of weaving together traditional ecological knowledge with climate science, and of overcoming human-centered approaches which separate people from nature, nurturing the concept of relationality, which will deepen connections between people and other living beings and the material and immaterial worlds. If this is taken seriously, conflict-sensitive climate change adaptation and climate change-sensitive conflict prevention and peace building have to go far beyond current mainstream research and policy. And in this context, the concept of relationality and the dialogical approach of the declaration are particularly important. So the Pacific eco-relationality approach, which is reflected in the Toda Pacific Declaration, and which has guided our work at Toda together with partners from the Pacific, is grounded in indigenous ways of knowing and being in the world. It gives priority to relations, interactions, and flows over entities, units, and structures. It takes human beings not as isolated individuals, but as members of communities, defined through their not only rational, but also effective and spiritual relationships with other human beings, as well as with actors beyond the human sphere, in nature and the spiritual world, spirit world, with ancestors, unborn generations, and other than human beings. Pacifica relationality is cosmocentric, which demarcates a fundamental difference to anthropocentric Western philosophies. And this has fundamental consequences for addressing the nature-environment-human connection, for how to position humans in the world, namely not as separated from other beings, as exceptional, as crown of creation, but as entangled in all sorts of relationships with other than human beings, with nature and the environment. And this again has fundamental consequences for addressing the climate emergency and the climate conflict peace nexus. From the standpoint of Pacific relationality and cosmocentricity, even such a progressive concept as human security is found wanting. It separates human society from nature and posits that there can be security for humans in separation from security for the rest, in quotation mark. Pacific relationality provides a non-anthropocentric, cosmocentric, eco-relational approach which has far-reaching consequences for the study of climate change adaptation and governance, conflict prevention, and peace building. These consequences become clear, for example, when thinking about the climate change migration conflict nexus. There is consensus in the research community today that various forms of climate mobility, displacement, relocation, migration, and their conflict potential have to be the focus of future research, as well as of peace-building policy and practice. In the Pacific region in particular, it is highly likely that climate change will increase human mobility. Communities on low-lying atoll islands, in deltas and floodplains, and along the coast are particularly at risk, and relocation further inland or to higher ground, to urban centers, is a likely response. And such migration can be conflict-prone. Conflicts between communities that have to relocate and host recipient communities are a case in point. These can be conflicts over access to natural resources like land, water, or fish, or conflicts over access to employment and public goods like education or health. Furthermore, the Pacific relational approach allows us to understand the climate mobility conflict nexus in a much more comprehensive way than is usually the case in climate change migration conflict studies. Research that merely looks at the issue as a technical, economic, legal, and maybe political one risks to miss its conflict potential and to fail in conflict prevention. By contrast, the concept of relationality allows us to comprehend the significance of the land identity connection in Pacific Island cultures. So land and people in the Pacific are closely interconnected. The term Vanua in Fiji or Whenua in Tuvalu, for example, mean both land and people. Land is an extension of the people, and the people are an extension of the land. Land cannot be understood merely as the physical location where people live or as an economic asset, but has to be understood in terms of its social, relational, cosmological, and spiritual dimensions. Accordingly, identity for Pacific Islanders is inextricably linked to land, to the place of origin. Their security as ontological security, security of being, is fundamentally emplaced. It is relational security, embedded in the network of the Vanua, grounded in the spiritual meaning of the land-people relations. And this connection between land and people is under fundamental threat due to the effects of climate change, like sea level rise, coastal erosion, and so forth. And so also the land-based identity of people is under fundamental threat. And the Toda Pacific Declaration therefore urges us to acknowledge, I quote, the inseparable connection of Pacific peoples to the land, which is fundamentally, culturally, and spiritually linked to identity. Therefore, the loss of land means a loss of cultural identity. So climate change-induced migration, therefore, does not only have serious implications for the material security of affected communities, but also affects the emotional and spiritual well-being, their ontological relational security. So it is a deeply traumatic experience to have to move, particularly once the option to go home does not exist anymore. An eco-relational approach allows us to grasp these dimensions of the climate change conflict peace nexus. Most importantly, peace building as well as climate change adaptation in a relational Pacific understanding cannot be had without the inclusion of the spiritual dimension. And against this background, the climate crisis and enforced displacement and relocation that come with its effects can be interpreted as forms of cultural and epistemic violence. In fact, these forms of violence, which impact on ontological and relational security, can be more significant in the Pacific than forms of direct physical violence. They are often poorly understood by outside researchers and policymakers who come from a Western secular background and all too often ignore the cultural and spiritual dimension. And all this means that the dominant narrow Western approach to climate change, conflict, security, and peace has to be overcome. Western ways of knowing have to be aligned and combined with alternative ways from the Pacific and elsewhere. This is why the Toda Pacific Declaration has a strong focus on, I quote again, weaving together, building linkages, supporting bridging institutions, including different worldviews, nurturing cross-cultural dialogue, integrating Western and Pacific ways of thinking. And in this context, the bridging institutions mentioned in the declaration are, I think, of particular importance. Such bridging institutions are familiar with both worlds and both views of the world, so to speak, Western and Pacific or other non-Western cosmologies and epistemologies. They are well positioned to bring together local, indigenous, traditional knowledge about climate change and peace building and international scientific knowledge. What is needed is the co-production of knowledge and dialogue across cultural difference between the West and the rest, difference between academia and politics, difference between research and practice, between different worldviews and ways of understanding the world. Weaving the mat is an excellent Pacific metaphor for such an approach. And weaving the mat, this is what we tried to do over the last years in the Toda Peace Institute's Climate Change, Peace and Conflict in the Pacific workstream. Bringing together academics, policymakers, practitioners from Pacific Island countries and the West or global North for exchange, dialogue, and collaboration. And main knots in the mat are the yearly workshops that the Toda Peace Institute has conducted over the last years, starting with a workshop in Auckland in 2018, from which the Toda Pacific Declaration emerged, through workshops in Tokyo in 2019, Suva hybrid in 2020, Wellington in New Zealand in 2021, and most recently in Canberra in September 2023. So before I'm going to end this lecture with a few conclusions and recommendations, let me give a brief overview of the content of that latest workshop in Canberra, because this can illustrate the content and scope of our work. So under the title, The Pacific and Its Peoples in a Changing Climate, Pacifica, Wisdom and Relational Security, the workshop's specific intention was to present genuinely Pacifica ways of approaching the climate conflict peace nexus and engaging them in dialogue with a more mainstream Western, Northern, or international hegemonic discourse. Accordingly, the workshop commenced with a presentation of the concept of Pacifica relationality and addressing the climate emergency challenges through the lens of relationality. And this also included the experiences and knowledges of indigenous peoples in Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, and Maori in New Zealand. And this then was followed by the exploration of several thematic areas of relevance for the climate conflict peace nexus. Climate change-induced human mobility in its various forms, addressing topics such as inhabitability or uninhabitability of islands and mobility and immobility of people, labor mobility, planned community relocation, migration and diaspora experiences, particularly of young Pacific people, and loss and damage. And just to give you one example of how the specific Pacifica relationality approach played out in addressing these topics, the discussion about loss and damage, which is a very important issue in the international climate discourse, as we have seen recently in COP28. These discussions about loss and damage were not confined to the physical, material, economic losses and damages that come with the effects of climate change, but non-economic loss and damage figured prominently. People in the Pacific also suffer from cultural and spiritual loss, loss of knowledge, of sacred sites and graveyards, of history and identity. This is loss and damage which equals cultural violence, and it cannot be monetized. No amount of money can compensate for such losses. But it nevertheless has to be addressed, and ways of compensation have to be found. and also climate security was a major topic of the workshop. But again, this topic was not just discussed in the narrow confines of mainstream Western understandings of the climate security issue, but in its various forms and under varying aspects. For example, national security, cultural security, human security, ecological security, and relational security, bringing together the protagonists of these different approaches in dialogue. The discussions showed that national security, for example, in Australia these days, is conceptualized in a much more comprehensive and holistic way than in the past. And it is acknowledged by protagonists of national security that the national security of Pacific Rim countries like Australia, international and regional security, and the security of Pacific Island countries and communities in Pacific Island countries are closely linked. There are common security interests which encompass also the food security of women on an island in the Marshall Islands, the cultural security of the inhabitants of an island in Vanuatu, or the ontological security of communities who have to relocate. And I think the workshop succeeded in its aim to advance a better mutual understanding of concerns and approaches of stakeholders who come from different epistemological traditions and different fields of practice. And the success was not least grounded in the culturally sensitive way of conducting workshops like this, as pursued by the Toda Peace Institute and its Pacific partners. An Aboriginal smoking ceremony, poems and songs, emotions and tears, personal stories and oral history were integral parts of the workshop. And this opened avenues for knowing, understanding, learning, and communicating well beyond the constraints of conventional academic political gatherings. What the Canberra workshop demonstrated and what our collaboration with Pacific partners over the last years has shown is that research on and from the Pacific, conducted along the lines of Pacific concepts, can make an important contribution to the wider international debate about climate change, conflict, peace, and security. Pacific themes and Pacific views widen the perspective beyond conventional mainstream approaches, taking into account so far underestimated or marginalized aspects. Pacific voices introduce relational, effective, non-anthropocentric perspectives that provide insights and entry points for policy and practice, which so far have been missed by the Western-dominated international discourse. And in this context, climate justice has to come to the fore. The negative effects of climate change constitute new forms of structural and cultural violence. And this means violation of climate justice. Climate-related livelihood loss, diseases, insufficient food and water, and so forth, that is the effects of structural violence and the loss of place-based cultural identity and traditional knowledge, that is the effects of cultural violence, are in fact more immediate, more direct, and more pressing threats to many people's everyday security than the danger of armed conflict. Peace research, which encompasses research into the causes and forms of structural and cultural violence, links in with the concerns of climate justice. Moreover, the quest for climate justice provides a crucial link between the climate movement and the peace movement. I think peace activists should be aware of the climate emergency, and climate activists should be aware of the conflict potential of the climate crisis. Both the peace movement and the climate movement should support each other, acknowledging that climate change policies should be conflict sensitive and contribute to peace building, And peace building has to be climate sensitive and contribute to climate justice. Both the climate movement and the peace movement are international. They can only succeed as internationalist movements. This means, first of all, to be open to learn about the plight of people outside of one's own country. For example, to learn in Japan about the dire situation of climate-affected communities in the Pacific and inform the public in Japan about it. It also means to identify similar or overlapping concerns, exploring, for example, in which way coastal regions or small islands in Japan are affected by climate change in similar ways to those in the Pacific. And flowing from that, organize an exchange of experiences and activities in solidarity with each other. I am sure that Pacific Islanders are very interested in learning about the effects of climate change and the climate and peace movement in Japan. And I'm sure that they would love to share their stories with the people in Japan. Moreover, Japan should do more in support of climate adaptation in Pacific Island countries, make substantial contributions to climate financing, for example, the newly established Loss and Damage Fund, and help with the disaster recovery, infrastructure development, capacity building, and climate-related early warning systems. Finally, I think people in Japan have to challenge their own government and their own companies to do more to fight the causes of climate change, taking into account that a highly industrialized country like Japan, with its capitalist fossil fuel-based economy and consumerist lifestyle, is contributing massively to the causes of the climate crisis, while the contribution of the people in the Pacific is tiny, but they suffer most from its effects. The public in Japan has to call on the Japanese government to reduce dependence on fossil fuels and to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. Pacific Islanders are best supported if things in Japan itself change, away from fossil fuels, organizing a just and equitable transition to a decarbonized and resilient society, at the same time blocking false alternatives like nuclear power. And this finally leads me back to the beginning. The age of climate change is at the same time still the nuclear age, the age of nuclear weapons. The destiny of humankind rests on a double zero: zero nuclear weapons and zero carbon emissions, denuclearization and decarbonization. And to achieve this, the big task ahead for the joint peace and climate movement is to make this a reality. And peace research that addresses both the nuclear and the climate threat can try to support the climate change and the peace movement. Thank you very much for listening and for your patience. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, you're right. The wars in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas war are not caused by climate change, definitely not. But they exacerbate the climate crisis. Take into account that the war in Ukraine, in the first few months of the war, released hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And there was this sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline in September 2022. And this released large amounts of methane. In fact, it was the biggest ever point source release of methane in the world. And methane is a highly potent greenhouse gas. And during the war in Ukraine, there was deforestation, there were widespread forest fires, And all this, of course, was releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, so exacerbating the climate crisis. And more generally, one has to take into account that armies, the military, are the world's biggest consumers of fossil fuels. And they are major greenhouse gas emitters. So an estimate for 2022 said that 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2022 were from the military. So militaries and wars contribute massively to the climate crisis. And on the other hand, countries in war cannot really pursue climate policies and climate adaptation because they don't have the resources, they don't have the capacity, they have to focus on other issues. And of course, the wars increase their vulnerability to the effects of climate change. And finally, also, these wars hinder multilateral climate action. So my concerns, for example, was that the Israel-Palestine war would distract from COP28. And a lot of effort was put into dealing with the war, which could have been put into dealing with the climate negotiations. So to summarize, no, these wars are not caused by climate change, but they are linked to climate change. Yeah, it's really interesting to see that the governments and civil society of Pacific Island countries always have been very active at COPs, also at COP28 in December, and they made their voices heard loud and clear. So they were punching well over their weight at COPs, and they tried to bring across their main concerns. With COP28, it was first phasing out of fossil fuels. So in preparation of COP28, some Pacific Island countries, Vanuatu, Tonga, Tuvalu, and others, have proposed a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. If they are pursuing this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative, arguing that, I quote, fossil fuels are weapons of mass destruction. So phasing out of fossil fuels, stopping the subsidies for fossil fuel industry, and stopping the opening of new and expanding of existing coal mines, oil and gas fields. These were issues of particular urgency for the Pacific Island countries, and it was finance for climate change adaptation. So in COP27, the year before, there was a general agreement to have a loss and damage fund. And in COP28, there were commitments to operationalize this fund. And there was the expectation that major greenhouse gas emitting countries will make substantial financial commitments to this loss and damage fund. So some commitments have been made. The United Arab Emirates and Germany, for example, gave 100 million each. Others gave less. But this by far was not enough to really address the challenges of loss and damage in an area like the Pacific. And the big question also is, what arrangements will there be put in place so that the money really reaches the most affected communities on the ground? Often there's so many red tape and so many bureaucratic procedures that the people on the ground are not capable of really accessing the money. So that was the second big issue for the Pacific Island countries. First was phasing out of fossil fuels, and second was financing of loss and damage. Thank you. This is a very important but also very difficult question. I think the starting point is that it would be good to organize an exchange of religious and philosophical traditions that can challenge the mainstream secular Western approach. For instance, Buddhist approach and Pacifica relationality, to engage them in dialogue. The Pacifica relationality approach is linked to specific understandings of Christianity, for instance. And there are other indigenous traditions of indigenous peoples all over the world who have similar ideas and approaches. For instance, Native Americans in North America or the Aboriginals here in Australia. And I think many people in the Pacific Island countries who talk about Pacifica relationality do not really know that Buddhism has a very similar approach to these issues, and to organize some kind of exchange to find a common ground and then to somehow work together for a paradigm shift. And I think this is what is really needed, a paradigm shift that shifts away from the materialist economic thinking about the challenges of climate change to a more holistic way of thinking about it. And this would also mean, for instance, to bring faith leaders into these negotiations in a much more prominent way. I know that this will be very difficult, but I think this is something that is worthwhile to pursue further. And the first step, I think, is to organize exchange of these kinds of philosophies that are close, but that often do not really know about each other. Yeah, I can't say much more than I already said in my presentation. I think it's really important to put pressure on the Japanese government. And in order to be able to put pressure, you need to form alliances. So I think it's important to form alliances between peace movement and climate movement, but also between Japanese groups and Pacific groups. And this, I'm sure there are already attempts to do this, but I think this is really, really important. It's similar in Australia and Germany. It is important to put pressure on the own governments and the own companies. Yeah, I think in Japan and other highly industrialized countries, modernization has disrupted this connection to the land. I'm pretty sure that it was similar in Japan a couple of 100 years ago, as it also was in my country, in Germany. But urbanization and industrialization have alienated people from the connection to land. The majority of people in countries like Japan now live in cities, detached from nature, earning their livelihoods not directly from the land. This is totally different in the Pacific Island countries. There, the vast majority still lives in the villages, in the countrysides, and they live from the land. So they live from subsistence economy, from their food gardens. And so the connection to the land is much deeper because of that. They are much more dependent on living in harmony with nature. And this then leads to this mutual respect and dependence. And I think you can't reconstruct this in a society like the German, Australian, or Japanese society. But I think it's important to acknowledge that other people live in different ways and have a different connection to the land. And for dealing with the issues of climate change in a holistic and inclusive way, it is important to acknowledge that. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because I started working on these issues almost 30 years ago in the context of an international research project that was called ENCOP, Environment and Conflicts Project, where we were taking stock of all the violent conflicts under the sun that were in one way or the other caused or triggered by environmental degradation, including effects of climate change. And so we looked at all the different regions of the world, and I looked at the Pacific. And then this is when I came across the case of the Panguna gold and copper mine on the island of Bougainville in Papua New Guinea, which back then was the biggest mine, open pit mine in the world. And this mine caused a 10-year internal violent conflict in Papua New Guinea and Bougainville because of the environmental degradation. And so I followed what was happening in Bougainville, and then I learned about the Carteret Islands, which are small atoll islands that belong to the region of Bougainville, and the plight of the Carteret Islanders who were affected by sea level rise and so forth, and who had to relocate from their small islands to the main island of Bougainville, and ran into all sorts of conflicts because of that. And this is when I realized, oh, climate change has these effects that can also lead to conflict. And then I realized this is not only an issue of Bougainville and the Carteret Islands, but this can be found in other places in the Pacific. So this is how I started looking at these issues with a focus on the Pacific region. And I'm still very interested in what's going on in Bougainville and with the people from the Carteret Islands today.